Hey guys, it's Miss Johnson here, and I'm here to bring you our part 2 of the complex numbers video. So we're going to work on some more complex numbers tomorrow in class, and this is the second video that leads into that. We left off at the imaginary numbers parts. Now it seems weird to say that something is an imaginary number. That comes from our French mathematician René Descartes. Descartes worked on a lot of mathematical formulas for us. He proposed that the number I can be defined such that I squared is equal to -1. And where that helps us is when we have something like the square root of -1, that's going to give us I. So if I took the square root of both sides, the square root of -1, this would be the square root of I times I, so that'd just be one I outside. Okay, so that's an important thing to think about here. Let's take a look at an example. If I had 2x squared plus 2 is equal to 0, let's use that square root property that we just talked about in class today. So I'm going to subtract 2 from both sides. That means I have 2x squared is equal to -2. Then I divide by 2, and I'd get x squared is equal to -1. Now, up until now, we've just stopped you guys there and said, you know what, when you take the square root of -1, there's no answer. Well, that's because there's no real answer. There's not a real number answer, but there is an answer called an imaginary number, or what we call I. So this here would be x is equal to I, but then also in the square root world, we have that property where we can have the positive version of I or negative version of I. So it's plus or minus I there is what x equals. So I is what allows us to take the square root of a negative number. It's not a real answer, it's a non-real answer, but it is an actual number that we will look at. So let's talk about the square root of -18. So the way I think of this is I have the square root of -18. That's the same thing as saying the square root of -1 times +18. Excuse me. So if I think about breaking that apart, I can even further break that down into the square root of -1 times 9 times 2. And the reason I picked 9 and 2 is because 9 is one of those perfect square numbers. So then I know I can take this square root of 9 and bring it out. The square root of 9 happens to be 3, so I have a 3 out front. Now, the new addition to this is that we can take the square root of -1. The square root of -1 is going to give us an I. Square root of -1 is I. I still have the square root of 2 left over, so that's what this looks like. I have 3I times the square root of 2. If I take a look at the -125x to the 5th, this is the same thing as saying -1 times +125 times x to the 5th power. And we talked yesterday about how we can break down this x to the 5th. This x to the 5th is the same thing as saying -1 times 125 times x times x times x times x times x. And we learned that every 2 underneath makes 1 outside. So here's 2, I'm going to bring that out front. Here's 2, I'm going to bring that out front. I'm going to be left with 1 left over. So I also have the square root of -1, which we now know is I. So I have an I out front, I have an x out front, I have an x out front. Then this 125, this is the same thing as 25 times 5. And this can come out front because the square root of 25 is 5. So look at what we have left over. We have 5 and we have x. That's all that's left underneath. So now putting all this back together, I have a 5, I have an x squared, and I have an I out front. That leaves me with 5x left over underneath. Let's take a look at just one more together. If I take a look at the square root of -10 times the square root of -15, simplifying both of these, this would be the square root of -1 times 10. That's the square root of -1 times 15. And the square root of -1 is I. So I have I times the square root of 10. And the square root of -1 over here is I times the square root of 15. So then we end up with I times I, which is I squared, and 10 times 10 times 15, which is 150. Now, this has further simplifying that we can take care of here. I squared, we know, is -1. So I have a -1 out front, but then I can also take care of this 150. 150 is the same thing as 25 times 6. And again, I picked that 25 because it's a perfect square factor. So if I have 25 underneath, that means I have the square root of 5 outside. The 6 has to stay underneath because it has no perfect square factors. So this is -5 times the square root of 6. Okay. If I take a look at part D, in part D, we're looking at -2i times 7i. And basically, we're just putting these together. They're not underneath the radical sign, so I'm not trying to take the square root of them, but I can multiply them together. I would multiply the number parts and the i's, kind of like they're variables. -2 times 7 is going to give me -14, and I times I is going to give me I squared. But then we've learned now that I squared is -1, so that's the same thing as saying -14 times -1, and -14 times -1 is actually +14. So +14 is what I'm looking at there. All right, we're going to go ahead and stop our video for right now. And thanks for watching. We'll come back tomorrow and finish up the rest of these notes. And have a good night.